Case 1. John Norman Collins. John Norman Collins. The name sounded harmless, easy to overlook. A college kid, a motorbike enthusiast. Fraternity parties, friendly smiles, the kind of face you passed on the sidewalk without remembering. And that was the danger. Because while John Norman Collins blended in, something else was moving through the streets of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, quiet, patient, predatory. This is the story of the Michigan murders. The co-ed murders. A 2-year stretch between 1967 and 1969 when a college town stopped feeling safe, when footsteps behind you meant something else, when parents called their daughters twice a night just to hear their voices. It begins with absence, with rooms that didn't get unlocked again, with friends waiting too long outside dorm doors, with phones that rang and rang. The bodies came later. Young women, college age, hopeful, ordinary, vanished near campuses. They were last seen walking home, getting into cars, trusting that the short distance ahead was harmless. They were abducted, assaulted, killed. Sometimes their bodies were left where they would be found. Sometimes they were hidden just long enough to deepen the terror. Newspapers searched for names big enough to hold the fear. The Michigan murderer, the co-ed killer, the Ypsilanti Ripper. July 1967. Then again, and again. Each time, the circle tightened. Each time, the panic spread faster. Students stopped walking alone. Streetlights felt dimmer. Doors were locked earlier. And still, the disappearances continued. By July 1969, the pattern was undeniable, and the pressure to stop it was suffocating. This wasn't a single dramatic break. No instant confession. No miracle clue. It was the slow grind of police work. Eyewitness accounts stacked beside phone records. Timelines sketched and re-sketched. Forensics that didn't scream but whispered. Circumstantial pieces that, on their own, meant little. Together, they formed a picture that refused to let go. At the center of that picture was John Norman Collins. He was a student at Eastern Michigan University. Neighbors described him as personable, unremarkable, the kind of guy you might trust with a favor, the kind of guy who didn't set off alarms. But witnesses began to remember small things. A car, a conversation, a young woman seen getting in with a man who fit his description. Investigators traced last movements, who was seen where, and with whom, and those lines kept circling back. Then came the lies, dates that didn't match, stories that shifted, alibis that collapsed when checked against reality. When police searched the home he had access to, his uncle's basement, they noticed details that wouldn't stay quiet. Paint, stains, items that didn't belong, things missing when they should have been there. Each detail tightened the rope. Not one piece alone, all of them together. The case broke into the open with the indictment for the murder of Karen Sue Bainman, 23 years old, killed in 1969. The trial was public and brutal in its attention. A community packed the courtroom. Prosecutors laid out the pattern. Similar victims, similar circumstances, the same shadow moving through different nights. The defense argued scapegoating, misidentification, reasonable doubt born from fear. But the jury heard the repetition, the echo, the way the story kept returning to the same name. Guilty. John Norman Collins was sentenced to spend decades behind bars. For prosecutors, a chapter closed. For families, something else remained. Questions that never fully faded. Did one man commit every killing attributed to the Michigan murders? Or did the terror mask more than one predator? Some victims were never officially connected. Some doubts lingered in reports and memories. Closure, for many, arrived incomplete. What had changed was the town. Campuses learned caution. Police learned cooperation across jurisdictions. The illusion of safety cracked and never fully healed. The streets remembered. The basements remembered. The silence after midnight remembered. She stepped off the campus sidewalk and vanished. A college town turned hunting ground. That line still holds. John Norman Collins is locked behind iron bars. But the echo of those years still moves through Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, in warnings whispered to students, in lights left on a little longer, in the names that refuse to disappear. If this case hit you, like the video. Comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe to Real Crime Documentary Stories. Because that was only Case 1. And the next name froze an entire county in fear. Case 2. Oakland County Child Killer. No real name. No confirmed face. No body behind bars. Just a title that still tightens throats decades later. The Oakland County Child Killer. The words alone changed how parents raised their children in Michigan. They changed how doors were locked, how bikes were abandoned on lawns, how silence inside a house no longer meant peace. Between 1976 and 1977, something moved through Oakland County that did not rush. It waited, it watched, and it hunted children. Not one, not two, at least four. The victims were young, elementary school age, taken in daylight, taken from places that were supposed to be safe. Bus stops, neighborhood streets, ordinary afternoons that never reached dinner. Parents searched before police did. Then police searched harder than anyone ever had. Because this wasn't chaos. This was control. Each disappearance followed the same cold rhythm. A child vanishes. Panic explodes. Search parties comb woods and fields. Days pass. Hope thins. And then, months later, the body is found. Clean. Redressed. Sometimes with items returned that had been missing. That detail mattered. It still does. The killer washed them. Redressed them. Treated the bodies with a ritualistic calm that terrified investigators. This wasn't impulsive violence. This was method. The first disappearance shook the county. The second confirmed fear. By the third, parents were keeping children home from school. By the fourth, Michigan was holding its breath. News broadcasts cut into programming. Flyers covered storefronts. Tip lines flooded with calls. More than 100,000 tips would eventually pour in. One of the largest investigations in Michigan history unfolded, and still, the killer slipped through. The task force grew massive. Local police, state police, federal involvement. Profiles were built. Maps were layered with pins. Every known sex offender was questioned. Every suspicious vehicle was chased. Entire neighborhoods were interrogated. Nothing broke. The victims were found months after their disappearances, far from where they were taken. Dump sites carefully chosen. Not random. Not careless. The consistency haunted investigators. The children were not restrained when found. They were not buried. They were placed. That single word echoed through the task force. Placed. It suggested time, privacy, confidence, and someone who believed they would never be caught. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed the killer was a police officer. Others believed it was someone with access to evidence, someone who understood how investigations worked. Suspicions pointed toward powerful people, connected people. Names were whispered but never proven. One suspect would later be charged in an unrelated murder. Another would die before charges could be brought. Still others were questioned endlessly, then released into the quiet with nothing but suspicion clinging to them. The case poisoned trust. Parents stopped trusting strangers, then neighbors, then authority. Children were taught rules no child should need. Don't talk, don't wander, don't accept help, don't trust smiles. Years passed, then decades. Advances in forensic science reopened hope. Evidence was re-examined. DNA testing was attempted on preserved materials. Task forces were revived. New detectives inherited old boxes filled with photographs, notes, and unanswered questions. Still, no arrest. The Oakland County child killer remained unidentified. What makes this case different? What still haunts Michigan is not just the brutality, but the patience, the precision, the sense that the killer understood the system well enough to dance just outside it. Someone knew these children. Someone had access. Someone blended in. And somewhere, someone lived an entire life while carrying these crimes into the grave, or still carries them now. There was no courtroom moment, no verdict, no sentence read aloud. Only parents who never stopped waiting for justice. Only siblings who grew up in the shadow of names spoken softly. Only a county that still remembers exactly where it was when fear arrived. The dead don't forget, and neither does Oakland County. If this case unsettled you, like the video, comment where you're watching from, and hit subscribe to Real Crime Documentary Stories. Because the next name didn't hide in the shadows. He walked openly through Michigan and left bodies behind him. Case 3. Carl Coral Eugene Watts. A name that moved quietly through Michigan long before it crossed a courtroom threshold. A name attached to Sunday mornings, to calm hours, to moments when people felt safest, and that was the point. Carl Eugene Watts. They called him the Sunday morning slasher because of timing, not theatrics. Because again and again, violence arrived when routines were softest. Early hours, familiar routes, predictable lives. While churches opened doors and streets stayed quiet, Carl Eugene Watts was already moving. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't sound like one either. He blended. And that's why he lasted as long as he did. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, women in Michigan began disappearing or turning up dead under eerily similar circumstances. They were attacked while walking, while entering cars, while moving through everyday spaces. The method was consistent enough to suggest one offender, but scattered enough to confuse investigators working across different cities and jurisdictions. This was not a spree. It was a pattern stretched thin across years. Police would later believe Carl Eugene Watts may have killed dozens, possibly far more, across Michigan and later Texas. Estimates ranged wildly. Some investigators suspected more than 80 victims. Others cautioned restraint. What mattered most was what could be proven. And proof came slowly. Watts had a history. He had been arrested before. He had been questioned. He had been seen near scenes. But nothing ever held long enough. Witnesses were unsure. Evidence was thin. And Watts kept moving. Then came Texas. In Houston, the violence resumed with chilling familiarity. The same types of attacks. The same confidence. The same ability to vanish afterward. But this time, something changed. In 1982, Carl Eugene Watts was caught in the act of attacking a woman. Police intervened. Lives were saved. And for the first time, the pattern had a body attached to it. Watts was convicted in Texas and sentenced to prison. Many believe the nightmare was over. But Michigan hadn't forgotten, because too many unsolved cases still pointed backward, toward him. Years later, Michigan prosecutors reopened files that had never rested easy. Advances in investigation, re-examined witness statements, and Watts' own history aligned. In 2004, he was brought back to Michigan to stand trial for specific murders committed years earlier. The courtroom was heavy. This wasn't just about individual victims. It was about time lost. About a killer who may have walked free while dozens of cases stayed open. About families who had waited decades just to hear a name spoken out loud in court. Carl Eugene Watts was convicted in Michigan for murder and sentenced to life in prison. For some families, it was the first time justice felt tangible. For others, it came too late to feel complete. Then, in 2007, before more trials could unfold, Watts died in prison. And with him, many answers died too. No full confession. No final count. No complete map of where he had been, or who he had taken. What remained was fear recalibrated. Michigan learned that predators don't always rush. Some wait. Some return. Some move across state lines and let distance blur memory. And sometimes, justice arrives years later, after damage has already settled deep. Sunday mornings never felt the same to those who remembered. Quiet hours stopped being neutral. Routine stopped feeling safe. Carl Eugene Watts is gone, but the uncertainty he left behind still hangs over dozens of unsolved files. Names that may never be confirmed, families that may never know if their loss had a single face. The dead don't forget, and neither does Michigan. If this case tightened your chest, like the video. Comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe to Real Crime Documentary Stories. Because the next name didn't hide behind routine. He hid behind doors that were supposed to protect. Case 4, Anthony Guy Walker. The name didn't arrive with mystery. It arrived with certainty. With words spoken out loud. With admissions that could not be taken back. Anthony Guy Walker. By the time police fully understood who he was, the damage had already been done. Not once. Not twice. Multiple times, across Lenawee County, in a pattern that investigators would later admit should have been connected sooner. This wasn't a killer who hid forever. This was a killer who slipped through gaps. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, women began turning up dead in and around Lenawee County. Different locations, different circumstances, but the same quiet violence underneath. Some victims were found outdoors. Others were discovered after being reported missing. Each case opened. Each case investigated. And each case, at first, stood alone. That separation mattered. Because Anthony Guy Walker was not invisible. He was present. He was known to law enforcement. He had been questioned. He had crossed paths with the system before the full picture emerged. What finally broke the wall was not chance. It was pressure. Walker was arrested on unrelated charges. And under questioning, something shifted. What came next stunned investigators and devastated families. Anthony Guy Walker began to confess. Not vague statements. Not half admissions. Detailed accounts. He spoke about victims by name. About locations. About actions only the killer could know. He led investigators to places tied to unsolved cases. One by one, files that had gathered dust were pulled back into the light. The realization hit hard. These weren't isolated crimes. They were connected, and they had been connected all along. The court proceedings were heavy with regret. Prosecutors laid out timelines showing missed intersections, moments when stronger information sharing or earlier pattern recognition might have changed outcomes. Defense arguments mattered little in the face of confession after confession. Anthony Guy Walker was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. For families, there was finally a name to attach to years of not knowing. But justice carried a bitter edge, because answers arrived alongside the knowledge that earlier connections might have saved lives. This case changed how Lenawee County reviewed violent crime, how databases were checked, how investigators compared notes across cases instead of keeping them siloed. Walker's confessions didn't just close files, they exposed weaknesses, and those weaknesses lingered. The dead don't forget the pauses between questions. They don't forget the delays. They don't forget what almost stopped the pattern, but didn't. Anthony Guy Walker will never walk free again. But the lesson of his crimes still echoes through Michigan law enforcement training rooms and policy reviews. Patterns matter, and time is never neutral. If this case unsettled you, like the video. Comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe to Real Crime Documentary Stories, because the next name hunted the vulnerable and turned an entire city into a corridor of fear. Case 5, Benjamin Atkins. The corridor was supposed to move people forward. Instead, it became a hunting ground. Benjamin Atkins. Between 1991 and 1992, women began disappearing along a familiar stretch of road that cut through Detroit and Highland Park, the Woodward Corridor. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't remote. It was visible, busy, ordinary. And that visibility is exactly what made the violence harder to see until it was already everywhere. The victims were among the most vulnerable. Women living on the margins. Women whose disappearances did not always trigger alarms fast enough. They were last seen walking, waiting, trusting a short ride or a familiar face. One by one, they vanished into a city already stretched thin by crime, poverty, and overwhelmed systems. By the time police realized they were dealing with a serial killer, the number was already staggering. 11 women. 11 lives taken in little more than a year. The brutality was consistent. The locations clustered along the same artery of the city. The pattern was there, but it took time, coordination, and pressure for it to fully surface. At the center was Benjamin Atkins. He moved easily through the corridor. He knew which women would be missed slowly. He knew where attention drifted. He exploited gaps, social, economic, and institutional, that allowed him to operate in plain sight. When investigators finally closed in, the scope shocked even seasoned detectives. Benjamin Atkins confessed to killing 11 women. The admissions were direct. The details aligned with evidence across multiple crime scenes. Files that once felt disconnected snapped together. The courtroom was heavy with grief and anger. Prosecutors laid out the timeline, how quickly the bodies accumulated once the pattern began. Defense arguments faded beneath the weight of confession and corroboration. Benjamin Atkins was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But the case left scars beyond the verdict. It forced Detroit to confront a painful truth. When victims are vulnerable, predators notice. And when society looks away, even briefly, the cost can be devastating. The Woodward Corridor still carries traffic, still moves lives forward. But for those who remember, it also carries names that never reached their destinations. The dead don't forget the streets they were taken from. They don't forget who saw them last. They don't forget the silence that followed. If this case shook you, like the video. Comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe to Real Crime Documentary Stories, because the next name exposed failures so deep. They forced an entire system to answer for them. Case 6, Leslie Allen Williams. This name didn't just expose a killer. It exposed a system. Leslie Allen Williams. In the early 1990s, Michigan believed the danger was already locked away. That belief would cost lives. Leslie Allen Williams had a documented history of sexual violence. He had been convicted before. He had been labeled dangerous before. And yet, in 1991, he was released on parole. What followed became one of the most devastating indictments of Michigan's parole system. Teenage girls began disappearing. Not in chaos. Not in clusters that immediately screamed serial. but in a sequence that would later prove unmistakable. They were young. They were vulnerable. They trusted the wrong moment. Between 1991 and 1992, Leslie Allen Williams raped and murdered multiple teenage girls across Michigan. Each crime should have been impossible, because he should never have been free to commit them. The pattern emerged only after the damage was irreversible. Investigators retraced his movements and were forced to confront an unbearable truth. Warning signs had been there. Risk assessments had been filed. Prior convictions had been documented. But parole decisions moved forward anyway. When Williams was finally arrested, the case unraveled quickly. Evidence tied him directly to the murders. The brutality of the crimes left no room for doubt. Prosecutors presented a timeline that didn't just tell a story of violence. It told a story of institutional failure. In court, the focus shifted beyond guilt. The question became how. How did a man with this history walk free? How were warnings overridden? How many chances were given before lives were taken? Leslie Allen Williams was convicted and sentenced to multiple life terms in prison. He would never walk free again. But the damage didn't end with the verdict. Families demanded accountability. Media investigations followed. Policy reviews exposed deep cracks in parole supervision, risk evaluation, and interagency communication. The state was forced to confront what happens when systems prioritize procedure over protection. This case changed parole policy discussions across Michigan. It altered how violent offenders were evaluated. It became a reference point, a warning written in lives lost. The dead don't forget being failed twice. Once by the person who took them, and once by the system that let him walk. Leslie Allen Williams remains behind bars. But his name still surfaces whenever parole reform is debated, whenever risk assessments are questioned, whenever the phrase, "never again," is spoken with hesitation. If this case made you angry, like the video. Comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe to Real Crime Documentary Stories. Because the next name didn't slip through parole. He slipped through silence. And left bodies behind abandoned walls. Case 7. Shelley Andre Brooks. For years, the deaths felt disconnected. Separate scenes. Separate victims. Separate griefs. What tied them together would not be seen until science caught up with silence. Shelley Andre Brooks. Between 2001 and 2006, women began turning up dead across Detroit. Some were found in abandoned buildings. Some in isolated locations where the city's collapse had created hiding places no one wanted to look too closely at. Each case opened. Each case stalled. And each case, at first, stood alone. That separation protected the killer. The victims were women on the margins, women whose lives unfolded in places society often ignored. Their disappearances did not always make headlines. Their deaths did not always trigger immediate alarms. And in that gap, Shelley Andre Brooks kept moving. The violence was personal. Strangulation. Close contact. No distance. No haste. These were crimes that required time and control. Investigators suspected a serial offender, but proof remained elusive. Evidence degraded. Witnesses vanished. Files stacked up. Years passed. Then science stepped in. Advances in DNA testing allowed evidence from multiple crime scenes to be re-examined and compared. Biological material that once meant nothing now began to speak. Slowly, unmistakably, profiles matched. Cases once treated as separate began to merge into one narrative. The same man, the same hands, the same signature. The name surfaced, Shelley Andre Brooks. Brooks had been on law enforcement's radar before, but never firmly enough. Now the evidence aligned. Investigators tied him to at least 7 murders. Some victims had gone unidentified for years. Through DNA, they were finally given names. Families who had waited in silence were finally contacted. The arrest was quiet compared to the years of violence that preceded it. But the impact was explosive. In court, prosecutors laid out the DNA links one by one. The science was precise. The connections were undeniable. Brooks was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. For Detroit, the case was a reckoning. It exposed how predators exploit neglect, how abandoned spaces become weapons, how victims can vanish twice, once in death and again in memory, until something pulls them back into the light. The dead don't forget when their names are missing. They don't forget being found years too late. They don't forget waiting for someone to notice the pattern. Shelley Andre Brooks will never walk free.
But the legacy of his crimes reshaped how Detroit revisits cold cases, how evidence is preserved, how DNA is used to speak for those who no longer can. If this case stayed with you, like the video. Comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe to Real Crime Documentary Stories. Because the next name showed how even in the modern era, a killer could move through the city and not be stopped in time.
Case 8. D'Angelo Martin. The city had already hollowed out. Blocks went quiet. Windows stayed dark. And inside those empty structures, something else took root. D'Angelo Martin. Between 2018 and 2019, women were found dead inside abandoned houses across Detroit. Not alleys. Not hidden forests. Homes, once lived in, now forgotten. The kind of places people stopped looking into because there were too many of them. That abundance was the cover. The victims were women on the margins, living in a city still carrying the weight of collapse. Some were reported missing. Some were not. Some deaths were initially treated as isolated incidents. Tragic, but unconnected. That delay mattered, because D'Angelo Martin was using the city's blind spots. He targeted abandoned houses that offered privacy, time, and silence. Places where evidence could sit, where bodies could remain undiscovered, where the absence of witnesses was almost guaranteed. As bodies accumulated, fear spread unevenly. Neighborhoods closest to the abandoned properties felt it first, then advocacy groups, then investigators who began to see repetition where none had been acknowledged before. The pattern wasn't subtle. It was overlooked. Evidence from early scenes sat in backlog. Reports moved slowly through systems already stretched thin. Tips came in, but without immediate linkage, urgency fractured. Each missed connection widened the window. When police finally focused on D'Angelo Martin, the picture snapped into clarity. Surveillance footage, witness accounts, physical evidence recovered from multiple locations. The abandoned houses, once treated as background noise, became central. In April 2019, Martin was arrested. The charges escalated quickly. Prosecutors tied him to multiple murders, all following the same grim logic: isolation, opportunity, neglect. The case ignited public outrage, not only at the crimes, but at how long it took to connect them. Backlogged evidence became a focal point. Why hadn't testing happened sooner? Why hadn't earlier deaths triggered alarms? Why did it take multiple victims before the pattern was acknowledged? In court, the evidence was overwhelming. D'Angelo Martin was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But the verdict did not end the conversation. Detroit was forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Abandoned buildings aren't neutral. Backlogs aren't harmless. And when victims are vulnerable, delay becomes dangerous. The dead don't forget the houses they were taken into. They don't forget waiting for someone to connect the dots. They don't forget being treated as background. D'Angelo Martin will never leave prison. But his case reshaped policy discussions about evidence processing, vacant property monitoring, and how quickly patterns must be recognized when lives are at stake. If this case unsettled you, like the video. Comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe to Real Crime Documentary Stories. Because the next name carried a secret so explosive, it tore open trust at the highest level. Case 9, Kenyon Brown. This case didn't just shatter lives. It shattered trust. Kenyon Brown. Between 2019 and 2020, a series of shootings tore through Wayne County. The violence felt random at first, separate scenes, different victims, no obvious single thread. But as investigators worked backward through timelines and locations, a disturbing picture emerged. The same name kept appearing, not as a suspect at first, but as a source. Kenyon Brown was known to law enforcement. Not just known, he was a confidential informant. Someone who provided information. Someone who, by definition, operated in the gray space between criminal worlds and police investigations. That status would later turn this case into one of the most explosive controversies Michigan had seen in years. As shootings accumulated, pressure mounted. Families demanded answers. Media scrutiny intensified. Detectives began to revisit evidence with fresh urgency. Witness statements that once felt incomplete now aligned. Ballistics testing connected scenes that had previously been treated as separate. The conclusion stunned the public. Kenyon Brown was identified as the prime suspect in multiple murders, a man allegedly operating both as a shooter and as a police informant at the same time. The revelation ignited outrage. How could someone accused of such violence remain active as an informant? What did police know, and when did they know it? Were crimes overlooked, minimized, or delayed because of his status? Before those questions could be fully answered in court, the case took a devastating turn. In early 2020, Kenyon Brown died by suicide. With his death, the possibility of trial vanished. No testimony, no cross-examination, no public accounting from the man at the center of it all. What remained was anger, confusion, and a storm of unanswered questions. Internal investigations were launched. Policies around confidential informants came under renewed scrutiny. Prosecutors reviewed whether earlier intervention could have changed outcomes. Families were left to grieve not only their losses, but the absence of closure. This case forced a hard reckoning. Informants are meant to help stop crime. But when oversight fails, the consequences can be catastrophic. The dead don't forget being caught in the middle of secrecy. They don't forget delays justified by usefulness. They don't forget the truth that never reached a courtroom. Kenyon Brown is gone, but his name still surfaces whenever law enforcement transparency is debated, whenever informant programs are questioned, whenever the cost of silence is counted. If this case disturbed you, like the video. Comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe to Real Crime Documentary Stories, because the final chapter reaches back further in time, to a criminal legacy that helped shape Michigan's darkest reputation. Case 10, the Purple Gang. This time, the horror didn't hide in alleys or abandoned houses. It wore suits. It carried guns openly, and it ruled entire neighborhoods through fear. Purple Gang. Long before serial killers dominated headlines, Detroit was already learning what organized violence looked like. In the 1920s, during Prohibition, Detroit became a gateway, one of the most valuable bootlegging corridors in America. Across the river sat Canada. Between them flowed money, alcohol, and blood. And standing in the middle of it was the Purple Gang. They weren't myth. They weren't exaggeration. They were real, and they were ruthless. The Purple Gang began as a street gang, but Prohibition transformed them into an empire. Smuggling liquor across the Detroit River brought profits beyond imagination, and the gang defended that money with intimidation, torture, and murder. They hijacked shipments, extorted rivals, eliminated anyone who threatened their control. Their violence was not impulsive. It was strategic. They used beatings and killings as warnings. Bodies appeared when messages needed to be sent. Competitors learned quickly: cooperate, pay up, or disappear. Detroit's underworld bent around them. The gang's influence stretched across Michigan and into national crime networks. Even notorious figures like Al Capone had to negotiate carefully when dealing with Detroit territory. The Purple Gang controlled the supply lines, and they enforced that control personally. Law enforcement struggled to contain them. Corruption ran deep. Witnesses vanished. Jurors were intimidated. Prosecutions failed repeatedly. For years, the Purple Gang operated with near impunity, shaping Detroit's reputation as one of America's most dangerous cities. But empires built on fear rarely fall quietly. Internal conflicts erupted. Members turned on one another. Alliances fractured. As Prohibition ended, profits shrank and protection weakened. Federal pressure increased. Arrests mounted. Trials finally stuck. By the mid-1930s, the Purple Gang collapsed under the weight of its own brutality. What they left behind was a blueprint. They showed how organized crime could thrive when systems were overwhelmed, how violence could be normalized, how a city's identity could be shaped by criminal legacy long after the gunfire stopped. The dead don't forget when violence becomes business. They don't forget when fear becomes currency. They don't forget the era that taught Michigan how dark power could get. The Purple Gang is gone, but Detroit still carries the shadow of what they built. If you stayed with us through all 10 cases, like the video. Comment where you're watching from. And hit subscribe to Real Crime Documentary Stories. Because names matter, patterns matter, and the dead never stop whispering them.